Many of y'all might be familiar with having been told that your psoas is tight or you need a psoas release. Well, I'm going to talk you through a couple of new exercises I bet you haven't tried to work on releasing the psoas. But first, let's talk about the anatomy of the psoas a bit here. So when we're thinking about the psoas, it actually inserts up on the front side of our lumbar vertebrae, starting kind of at that bottom rib here, and then goes all the way down through the vertebrae here, and then comes down and around onto our femur. So some of the actions that the psoas does is hip flexion, and it can be paired with some external rotation with that. But then as far as the spine goes, if that psoas is active and pulling, it can actually pull our spine forward, creating more of this high hinge point and extension higher up in the lumbar spine. We can also think about how its attachment actually creates a contralateral rotation. So my right psoas being tight would actually pull my spine to the left and make my belly button point off to the left side. It can also do side bending towards that side. So we can think about how a lot of time that QL here can contribute to the pelvis being pulled up because it attaches between the pelvis and the bottom ribs here and kind of shortens that space. But the psoas can also play a role on that spine there and be tight in that action. We think about, lastly with it, that when the back side of the pelvis is tight, that can push that femur forward and make that psoas feel tight because there's tension on it. So working on improving that femur position and then working on improving the positioning of the spine is going to help release that psoas and make it a little bit happier and release through some muscle activation versus just stretching. So let's go ahead and check out a couple exercises to see if we can work on making that psoas a little happier. So I brought in Sarah here to help be my lovely warm body to demonstrate this exercise for you. So the first one we're going to work on here is using an exercise that's normally used as looking at kind of glute med strength and movement, but we're going to use it to release the psoas. So here we're going to work on releasing the right psoas. Remember I talked about with this right psoas being tight, that can create a side bend and tightness up in here that can pull that pelvis up. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use gravity to let this right pelvis sink down towards the ground and feel how that tractions and lengthens the spine here. We want to make sure as we do that we don't shift over. She's still staying loaded on that left leg. And then just feeling how that right pelvis is getting pulled down lower than that left side. We're also making sure that those ribs don't flare, that pelvis doesn't dump forward, because that's going to keep the psoas tight back here. So keeping this connection here. And then she can just think about breathing and inhaling into her right side, into her back, and how that's expanding that space and further kind of tractioning that spine, and then exhaling and feeling it sink down a little bit lower with it. So now we're going to work on the rotation component to psoas. So again, we're going to stick with the idea of the right psoas being tight. And so remember, I commented on how it created contralateral rotation. So she would be kind of rotated towards the left here. We're going to use a wall as reference to help feel her ribs are going to get pushed back with this, okay? So what she's going to do here is she's against the wall and she's feeling her PSIS here, so the back of her pelvis is kind of equally on the wall. And between her shoulder blades is equally on the wall as well. I'm not so worried about her head because I don't want her to force that back, but just kind of thinking tall. So then now she's going to take her left arm and she's going to reach around and towards the right. So as she does that, this is going to bring these left ribs around and in, but then it's going to help push her right ribs back. So another reason the psoas can get cranky is because it can overwork for abs that aren't working to stabilize the spine, and so that psoas is working extra hard. So by bringing abs in here, that's giving the psoas some relief. Then we're working on compressing the ribs back to help get that length from the psoas here. She's going to inhale into her right side, into her back, and then she's going to exhale, feeling that connection of right rib towards left hip bone. As she goes to do this, we're making sure that pelvis doesn't move, so she's isolating that movement in her rib cage instead of just turning her whole pelvis that way with it.
Or hiking.
Yeah, or hiking that hip up. So remember, we're keeping this equal distance between each rib and hip bone. Good. Okay, relax for a second. So we can take a little step further if you're feeling spicy about it, and we can think about how we can now also work on some glute lengthening and opening of the back of the pelvis to help that femur get back in the socket that will also release the psoas. So now what she's going to do is she's going to maintain that rotation, and then she's going to slide slowly down the wall, making sure her hips stay with that equal pressure on that PSIS on the back side of her pelvis. So she's going to slowly kind of sink down, making sure she doesn't tuck more or arch more. When things start to feel a little sticky, she can pause, inhale, exhale, and work into a little bit more. Great. So it should just feel like her pelvis is kind of opening up as she lowers down with it. Great. And then we'll come back up.
Don't skip quad day.
Yeah. We're going to make it one more rep because I call that the secret workout, bonus workout. So then if we need a little more glute lengthening, we could add in maybe squeezing the block between the knees to help pull that sit bones wide from adding in that adductor squeeze as she goes to do that. You could also flip it. She could push her feet apart. So if I took the block away, she could push her feet apart without her knees turning out, driving a little more from the outside of her hips. That's going to kick in a little bit more glute med that can also open up the backside of that pelvis. So depending on what the person needs in front of you, you might add a little more adductors or add a little bit more glute med. But in the end, we're looking for that opening here and then making sure we get that good connection here to kind of untwist, improve that stack of that rib cage over that pelvis as she moves down into that squat. One last sneaky way we can work on releasing the psoas is looking at its different roles that it plays on the spine. So I mentioned that higher up in the spine, it's going to contribute to being in more of an extended position. However, at L5, it actually contributes to lumbar flexion and tucks under. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do an exercise where I'm going to have Sarah come lay on her back, and we're going to use a towel to be positioned underneath that lower lumbar spine to help push that lumbar spine into a little bit more extension to release the lower fibers of the psoas, but at the same time pulling our upper ribs back to release the top part of the psoas. Now, when it comes to the towel, you might have to play a little bit with size and location. So kind of, don't be afraid to move it around and kind of experiment to have it fit to the person that is in front of you. All right, so now I have Sarah set up here in a 90-90 position where her knees are bent at 90 degrees and her hips are bent at 90 degrees. We're having those feet up on a chair. You can do feet on a wall, but we're just making sure as we go to do this, we want to be able to feel some hamstrings here. I've placed the towel, like I mentioned, at that lumbar spine, lower lumbar spine, to facilitate some of that extension. You then want to make sure that people don't start already tucked. So you might have to cue this person to say, okay, let's sit your sit bones down, really make sure that they feel heavy with it. If you have someone that they lay on the back and they look like they're choking, we would put a pillow underneath their head. If they have a really big rib flare, you might put a couple pillows to help kind of drop their ribs down with it. So there's definitely some things that we can play with depending on the person in front of you. So what we're going to do here is we are going to get a little bit of active tension in those hamstrings. So Sarah's going to dig her heels down and she's going to think about how she's using those hamstrings to lift her sit bones up towards the ceiling and flatten a little bit into the towel. Now she's going to keep that hamstring tension, but now she's going to reach her sit bones back down towards the ground, letting her pelvis tip forwards and feeling how that kind of creates space and opening the backside of that pelvis, and again, kind of lifts up that lumbar spine. She's going to hold that position here with that hamstring tension, and I might even have her reach her arms up towards the ceiling to help feel that broadening in her back. She's going to inhale into her back, and then she's going to exhale, think hip bones, abs, ribs compress back, not letting her pelvis tuck anymore. So again, we're getting that breath and that upper insertion of the psoas here and getting that expansion from the inhale. And then with that exhale of her ribs compressing back into it, you're getting more core connection and you're getting that further opening here, but just maintaining that hamstring position on it. Great. And relax down for a second. We've also talked about how that psoas is an external rotator. So we can add the block, squeezing between the knees. You can go and experiment with that distance a little bit. So we're going to find those hamstrings to tuck under, keep that tension, and then reach those sit bones down towards the ground, feeling that pelvis widen a bit. She's going to squeeze the block to feel her inner thighs here, which will also help her connect with her core a little bit more as well. And then we'll reach those arms up. Good. Inhale into the back sides, hips. Good. Exhale, feeling everything wrap around and compress back without tucking more. Now, all this being said, I know that I've asked a lot of Sarah all in one go. So we can break it up into parts, right? We might just work on, okay, let's find those hamstrings. Step one, right? Can we feel that connection there? And that can take some time to build into. But then being able to say, okay, now can we keep that tension and then sit into it is going to help with unsticking the backside of that sacrum, as well as positioning that lumbar spine out of that lumbar flexion that's keeping that psoas tight. So a couple fun things all in one, but again, you can break down the individual parts and build it onto each other as the person can kind of take it on and work it all together. But it can be a really amazing exercise to get multiple bangs for your buck in one move.
Thanks, Anna.